Tad, you are the center of the universe. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Michael. Nice to be with you again.
Yes, now you're in Ithaca, New York, and you have written so many books. I got your I just got your newsletter the other day. Can you kind of go over a little bit of what's happening in terms of all these planets that we're dealing with right now? It seems to me that we're going through a major transition historically. This is a major time for everybody's life.
Well, I think a lot of things are happening, and you can feel it in the air. At the same time, one of the things that happens relatively recently, meaning every 3 or 4 years or 5 years, is when Venus has this retrograde cycle. It goes back past the sun, which it did about 4 or 5 days ago. In fact, it's called Kazemi, and it basically means that Venus, is a star that's an evening star for most of its time, but at a certain point, it goes retrograde back past the sun, and when it passes the sun, it's called being in the heart of the sun, and that should be a turning point in all kinds of ways in terms of world affairs. It's supposed to bring out a lot of love, although I have to be honest and say I don't see a lot of that in the air these days. But I do think that it is a significant influence. There's no question about it. And also, as it turns out, a number of the planets are in the process of going or are about to go retrograde, in the sense that Venus is already retrograde and will be for the next month or so. Mercury goes retrograde on the 23rd of August, which is in another week. And in fact, Uranus goes retrograde on the 29th. So it turns out there's a lot of backward movement, which to me always means that, we're recapitulating things that have already come about. And since there have been so many radical changes of, in political ways in this country, this sort of movement to the right, the rise of conservatism, coinciding with Trump and so on. I think the only reason he wants to be elected president is so he can, allow himself to avoid any kind of jail time.
But Tad, if I may, one of the things I get annoyed about the media, because they should know better. I get very annoyed when they say that the reason he wants to get into office is so he can pardon himself. Let me tell you something. There's no way in hell, number one, that he can pardon himself. I don't care who you are. The Constitution, the whole reason we have a country is because we don't want a king. We don't want a king be able to pardon themselves. There's no way the Constitution or the Supreme Court could ever allow anybody to pardon themselves. And they know that, but they are disingenuous because they know it sounds good, but it's just not possible.
Yeah, but also the only thing, Michael, is that it hasn't ever been tested. And so we don't really know. And also with, a particularly conservative Supreme Court, and one that's been shown recently to be taking all kinds of, interesting advantages from being in the Supreme Court, it's really an open air issue, especially because, of course, Pluto is coming very close to the return of the 1776 revolution. So the whole idea is that the return of Pluto to where it was when America was founded means that it's really rocking its basic foundations right at this moment. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen. I hope it doesn't. But at the same time, you never really know. You don't really know what's going to come about.
From my perspective, the Supreme Court would be totally out of bounds to allow anybody to pardon themselves. It's so antithetical to what we did with the Constitution. I just don't see it. Not at all. Ever, ever, ever.
Okay. I understand that you sound, I don't know if I ever have heard you be so emphatic about things like this, but it is interesting that it is a real test of what's actually going on. And I think, I hope that it isn't as deep as we worry that it could be. But of course, the press, their function really in this day and age is really to exaggerate all kinds of issues just for the sake of, for the sake of selling newspapers.
Well,
And I really worry about that aspect of it as well. I agree with you there.
you know, Tad, I mean, we grew up at a time when we only had three channels of television, and the news was not a moneymaker. It was there to provide information. It was a lost leader, in fact. But now it's become a juggernaut of making money, so they'll say and lie whatever they have to make money. CNN has proven that recently, having Trump on the air, and of course Fox now finally paid that penalty of so many, over $700 million that they had to pay out. And there's another chunk of change is going to come out of their bank soon as well.
Yeah. I mean, I understand all of that, and I'm saying the difference in a way is that they're owned by corporations, the newspapers nowadays, and the corporations have incredibly wide financial reach over what goes on in the country. And so the difficulty basically is that, you know, the media is basically owning the country in all kinds of ways. They can basically say whatever they want. I think the Fox thing was actually wonderful to see that happen, to realize that it does have a self-correct apparatus available. But if anything actually ends up going to the Supreme Court, I really worry about that, and in particular because obviously they are unbelievably biased.
Well, clearly, Alito and Clarence Thomas, those two alone are out to lunch. I mean, they're just so bizarrely out of touch with reality. And we definitely have a lot of explaining to do to our younger children. And hopefully they're the ones that are going to save our butts, because I know our generation in the 60s, we changed the direction of this country. And I think this next election, the children are going to finally speak up. I think that's going to be the major story aside from the women. I think the children voting in colleges is going to make a big difference this time.
I hope so. You know, I mean, of course, the Republican Party is out trying to suppress that as much as possible. But I hope you're right, and I think you're right, and I also think it's a very dodgy time, and it could go either way. Yeah, I think it's interesting also with Venus going, you know, connecting to the heart of the sun. You know, as you know, I had open heart surgery 2 years ago, and I began to realize after a while that what did that really signify? Because I think when medical things happen to us, it tells us something about who we are. And I began realizing that I've almost always acted my life from my brain, from what I'm thinking, rather than from what I'm feeling. And I really think this is an opportunity to turn in that direction, which I think would be a very positive one for our country in general. So I'm hoping that the Venus Cazimi is something that means a lot more than it has typically done historically. And I kind of trust the planets in really putting us right. And I think you're right about that, but at the same time, one can't help wondering for sure.
Interesting you mentioned about the heart. You know, just a brief story. When I was born, I had a heart murmur. And the first thing they ever gave me, and this was a military hospital in Tokyo, Japan, they gave me a teaspoon of whiskey to calm down the heart. And so that calmed the heart down. And so I've had a heart murmur all my life. And then when I was in my 50s, I started doing yoga. And after about 5 years of doing yoga, I went to see a doctor, my regular doctor. I hadn't seen him in a few years. And he said, "What's going on?" I said, "What are you saying?" He said, "Well, you don't have a heart murmur anymore. How did that happen?" I said, "Well, I've been doing yoga for 5 years. He says, "Well, you just added 10 years to your life because you no longer have a heart murmur."
Well, I mean, that's terrific. I mean, it's great for you, and I'm sure that those things work. You know, it's so weird because in 2 days I turn 80, which I can't believe, simply because I still do feel like a kid in some ways, and I still feel that energy from the 60s that was so prominent when we were at a certain age. And I really do believe that, you know, we are as young or as old as we think we are. And that I think that that's a really significant dynamic. I think doing yoga is incredible. You know, I've been doing Qigong for the last 15 or 20 years. And, you know, that also is one of those things that just makes you feel younger and act younger, and your body feels younger.
Well, clearly, keeping the body active is one of the more important things about health that the older generations, I mean, to be honest with you, I never saw my mother or father ever, mind you, never ever run. Never in their, I never saw them run ever.
Except maybe from each other.
No, fortunately, they stayed together for 44 years, and they were actually a great couple. But no, but I find that interesting. But that generation, the older generation, the World War II generation, the war was enough activity for them. They didn't need to go out running around.
Yeah, well, my stepfather was actually another case in point because he was a quarter miler in college, and it's not that he ran when he was older, but he did play squash, and he was, incredibly active, and I think that's the real key. I mean, he lived into his late 80s, and I'm hoping to do that and maybe even go beyond it.
Now, by the way, a friend of mine, because I told her you were going to be on the show, and she said, oh my gosh, please ask him this question. And I've asked you this before, but just for her, I'd like you to talk to people about, you are unique in the way you read an astrology chart. You're not just their average astrologer. You're I think you're a Valence, by the way. I think back in Rome, you were that guy, because I think Valence was one of the first people to do your method. Isn't that correct, or similar to what you're doing?
Well, I don't know whether anyone has done something similar to what I'm doing.
Yeah, there was. And when I was at Kepler College, I think his name was Valence, and there was a gentleman, he was the first person that we knew of that did that.
Well, the idea that basically has run me all along comes from the work of Gurdjieff, for one thing, the from the 20th century. But the basic idea is traditional astrology, even at its most sophisticated level, does not present a person with a time scale of their lifetime. Meaning that, to my mind, our birth chart shows what happened when we came into the world. It's almost like a show of our potential, but it doesn't really indicate whether we have the capacity to enact it and bring it into being or not. So the technique that I use uses a time scale that is different for a number of different reasons. First of all, I began realizing that the sequence of the signs of the zodiac and the sequence of the houses show a process, and that we follow that process in our lifetime. We're born on the ascendant, and we go through, the first 3 or 4 houses of the first 6 or 7 years of our life. And as we age, basically we move around the chart in a counterclockwise direction. So we're reaching, the 7th house is around the time of partnership, from our 20s to our early 40s. The 8th house is from our mid-40s or early 40s until the end of our lives. So in a way, it's also a fascinating way of looking at a life, because it does really talk to where you've been, where you are at the moment, and of course where you're going. And I think this is so helpful to most people for whom I do readings. Another interesting thing, I've just written an article for an alchemy journal in the UK, and it's called The Essential Dynamic of Gestation in Astrology. I go to astrology conferences, as you know, and you do also, and the whole idea is I almost never hear the phrase gestation mentioned by other astrologers. And the idea is that we don't come into the world as an empty canvas. Actually appropriate to your story just now, we come into the world with all kinds of parental baggage. It comes from our parents' relationship, our parents' generations, basically, the way they saw the world. Whether we take that on or not is a whole other issue, because we have an opportunity to either accept it or reject it. But I think the gestation period in my system, the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th houses, that show while our mother is pregnant with us, gives us a tremendous clue as to what we're coming into the world carrying. And I begin to realize more and more that it's not only what happened while we were gestating, because if you think about it, our gestation is how we were created. And I see gestation, those 4 houses, as a metaphor for how we create in the world also. meaning the ninth house is being we generate as a worldview, a set of, a religious belief system of some kind. We develop a kind of worldview. In the 10th house, we begin to find some way of manifesting it out in the world. The 11th house, we attract allies and friends and supporters, and we're aligned with particular idealistic causes. And the 12th house, the time leading up to the birth moment, is the end of gestation, when we're very much like Pisces. We're attached to our mother by a cord, an umbilical cord. We're receiving nutrition through it, and we're swimming in the amniotic fluid, very much like the two fishes. In fact, I think the ancient symbols of Sag, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces are all simultaneously, they're not really human beings per se. They're actually transitions of that animal dynamic in us into becoming fully human. It's like the Sagittarius centaur is basically a human torso on a horse's body. Capricorn is a goatfish, it's when we're swimming in the amniotic fluids. And Aquarius is like two water snakes swimming in opposite directions. And Pisces are these two fish. So I really think that we need to go back to our roots, back to our beginning in the world, which happened around the time our mother conceived us and brought us into being. And also it has another interesting side effect, which is that by trying to understand what our mother felt like while she was bringing us into being, it really brings us a different degree of respect for the feminine. And a respect for the mother in particular, and our mother specifically. And I think that this is something that it's interesting. I noticed that with women, it has an even larger impact than it often does for men. Women suddenly say, oh my God, I never realized what my mother really went through while she was carrying me. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is really so critical because it brings us back into touch with our own beginning. And it allows us to be much more open-minded about integrating the feminine. And I know that that's a major issue in our world. We see this all the time around I think one of the most hopeful ideas about what's actually happening now in terms of politics is that women are taking a much greater role. The whole, the Supreme Court ignoring the abortion rulings from 50 years ago has made a gigantic difference in the political perspective. And I think that as well, I think that astrology is a primary agent which allows the feminine energy to really have its rightful place in the world around us and within us.
Tad, if I may, real quick, I've always wanted, I guess I might have asked you this over the years, but was there a moment when you realized that gestation was the key for your way of doing an astrology chart? Was there something that triggered you that make you do the kind of system that you created?
God, yes, absolutely. Do you know why, Michael? Because while my mother was pregnant with me, my father went off to the Second World War and ended up being shot down in the North Sea. He was an American bomber pilot based in the UK. He was bombing one of the ports on the North Sea that was where the German submarine base was. And basically he died while my mother was carrying me.
Jesus. And
so I kept wondering, when I started learning astrology, where would I see my father's death, which happened while I was in the womb? And of course I had the sun in the 9th house square Mars, sextile Saturn. That was when he went off to war, very soon after my mother conceived me. So really the whole origin of my theory about all these things, which ends up being quite universal, to me came from an unbelievably personal back history of my own. I came into the world with no father. I've had to look for my father. And I look to astrology for one of the main factors that has allowed me to do that and to move ahead with it. And I think it really is major that this was actually such a primary factor. And I can tell you that a lot of people also have sort of incorrect knowledge of their parents' real role in bringing them into being. maybe the sacrifices they made, maybe the issues around whether we were the gender they wanted or not, and all kinds of things like this, which are becoming major issues these days. I live in a college town in Ithaca, New York, where Cornell University and Ithaca College are, and I can tell you that gender issues are major among almost all young kids. A lot of them are very confused, and I think my way of doing astrology is one of the few that actually helps clarify that. If you have a sun and a moon and masculine signs like air or fire signs, and the moon and feminine signs, earth or water signs, it may well determine whether you're feminine pronounced or masculine pronounced, or whether you're a guy but actually have a strong feminine energy, or a girl has a strong masculine energy. I think all of these things are really something that I've tried to integrate as well as I possibly could in my whole view of the world. And, you're one of the people I know who's appreciated that as much, if not more, than anyone that I've been in touch with. So I have really a lot of thanks for you for that process. And just even being on your program on a regular basis has made a huge difference to me. And I appreciate that about you and your work.
Well, I appreciate that very much. As a kid growing up, living in Germany, we had this Telefunken, and I was on the shortwave radio, and late at night after my parents would go to sleep, I'm 10, 11 years old, I would go and stay up 3 or 4 hours at night listening to the BBC and everything, and world news at night, all as a child. So the radio and reaching out has always been a part of my life. So I think doing radio for the last many years that I've done was a part of my integration of who I was growing up.
Yeah, and it's a great benefit, And again, someone as open-minded as you are about most things, it's a great benefit to all of those people out there that really are on the fence in particular issues, who maybe aren't so familiar with things that are happening in the astrological world. But, you're bringing a lot of things to people's awareness, which I think have the potential to really change things in good directions, in positive directions. And, I have to thank you for that. I really do believe that.
Well, thank you, Ted. Another question I want to ask you quickly, too, is you are so unique in what you do. Can you explain to people, because I was shocked when I had a reading with you, you explained to the client what their parents were actually going through. And I think that's what's so unique about your reading. It gave me a really better understanding of my parents.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That was really a major effect, because I began to realize that if we're including the gestation period, then basically the entire gestation actually starts with your mother. Meaning, when she makes love, the egg that is fertilized is inside of her. So basically, the fertilization happens in your mother, and you exist within your mother for those 9 months of gestation. And so I felt like the only way I could possibly represent that to a person is to approach the gestation period as though I'm actually your mother.
That's interesting.
From a woman's point of view. And so that forced me as a young man. I was lucky, because it turned out that when I learned and taught myself astrology, that I was actually becoming a parent, and my daughter was gestating throughout the time that I actually learned astrology. So I was really watching that all happen with my partner. Well, and I think that was really significant. I thought the only way you can represent it is to try to put yourself in the places of your parents. The moon is your mother and the sun is your father. And they represent these two genetic streams that are coming together in you. And, any aspects in your chart between the sun and other planets are qualities coming from your father's lineage. And any planets relating to the moon are coming from your mother's lineage. And planets that have mutual aspects are coming from both. So it's an integration of the two of them. Because that's what we are. We're basically, as an individual, we're a bridge between mother and father, and between sun and moon, and between masculine and feminine. And I think that that's really a very healthy way of seeing our own role, our own sexuality, our own gender issues, and in fact, even the view of the world is that these two views are continually necessary and important and necessary to be seen as being equal and balanced and integrated within us. And once we can do that within ourselves, our world, even though it may look far away, could potentially move towards a position of greater integration also. And that's my hope.
Tad, we only have a minute left. Give your information out so people can reach out and touch you.
Yes, I have a newsletter which I write every new and full moon. In fact, I've just recently gone on Patreon, and in fact, my newsletter, which is free, all you need to do is to email me at atmann, ATMANN, number 4 at gmail.com and ask to be put on my newsletter list, and I will send you one every month. A new and full moon report. And I think it's astrological completely, but also it'll bring up a lot of things that I think you will find of interest and are intriguing, including some of these broadcasts with Michael, believe it or not.
Oh, that's right. I forget you do record these, and thank you so much for everything. You've been an important part of my life as an astrologer. You've been a great teacher and mentor to me, and I just want to thank you so much.
Well, the feeling's mutual, Michael, and let's continue to do it. Let's go for it.
All right, sir. Take care of yourself, and we'll be in touch soon.
Yeah. Lots of love, Michael, and thanks.
Thank you. Bye. You're listening to the Center of the Universe, and just to remind you, Mercury goes retrograde on the 23rd of August, and also on the 24th, Mars trines Pluto. That's a really positive day for you. 27th, Mars enters Libra, and of course, putting the emphasis on relationships. You're listening to the Center of the Universe. Stay tuned.